The TV programmes and books marking 100 years since the First World War all tend to focus on the horrors of the trenches. But the Great War was also fought at sea. In fact, the naval arms race between Great Britain and Germany, each building bigger and better battleships, contributed to the initial breakdown in relations. The Royal Navy at that time was the largest in the world, 650 ships and more than 200,000 men serving in August 1914. And the story of just one of those men is told in his own words in a new book called Smudge's Story. Smudge was Frederick Smith. He signed up to escape the poverty of life at home. He served as a stoker in various vessels, being in the thick of rescuing women and children from torpedoed liners and hunting U-boats. Smudge's granddaughter, Wendy Reader, lives near Great Yarmouth. She's edited the book and joins us in the studio now. Good afternoon, Wendy.
Thank you, Matthew. Nice to be here.
So this book is in his own words. Was it written as a diary at the time or a memoir from later?
Yes, it's not really a diary. He does give some dates, but it was really just written up in old school books in the 1960s after his wife died. He lived in Kent, and I think the long, cold evenings made him just sit and write it all down. And it reads absolutely wonderfully. You can just sit down and read it as he wrote it.
Yes, and it really is... You know, it is very vivid, isn't it? Let's say and it's very direct language. And
absolutely.
That's, I think, a great strength.
Yes, he was a Cockney lad. He wasn't very well educated. I think he left school at 13 and got various jobs before making himself tall enough to join the Royal Navy in 1913. But yes, it's incredibly vivid. The first part of the book deals with his childhood and youth and the poverty and how much things cost. His father died when he was very young. He was the youngest of 4 children. His mother actually remarried a German, and he had German stepsisters, which must have been an interesting family combination. And I think that's why he wanted to join the Navy and get away from it all.
But as you alluded to just now, in the book, it points out that he wasn't tall enough to join the Royal Navy, was he?
Right,
so how did he
yes.
get round that then?
Well, if you read it, he took himself off to local gymnasiums and stretched himself every night. He also taught himself to swim, although he wasn't a great swimmer, at the public swimming pool. And I think really just sort of willpower and perhaps cheating a little bit when it came to the naval medical.
And he was a stoker.
Yes, a lot of people don't realise that in those days the ships were powered by coal. And it was an incredibly hard, hot, dirty job going into docks every 3 or 4 days to stoke up the ship's hull with coal, enough to keep them at sea just for 3 or 4 days. And then they'd have to scuttle back to the port to stoke up again. Later in the war, they became oil-fired boilers, and he had to go back to Chatham to retrain to become an engineer with the oil engines. But being a stoker was the lowest of the lowest of the lowest job.
Which is why I think this is a very important book, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To learn the perspective, not of the man with the officer's braid on his shoulder, but actually, yes, down in the engine room.
Yep, receiving the controls from the captain's bridge to go backwards, forwards or whatever. More power needed, more power. And he'd be down there for hours and hours shoveling and getting hotter and dirtier.
How did he feel about the outbreak of war then? Because he was already in the Navy.
He was, yes. He joined up in 1913. And I think they all thought it would be over by Christmas, as we know. And he was actually thinking it was a great big adventure.
He was on board HMS Derwent, I think, on the day that war broke out.
Yes, that's quite an interesting story on that. He was in the North Sea, and the threat from the German U-boats could have happened at any time. And suddenly, on the day war broke out, all the lights along the coast were all turned off. So they didn't really know where they were or anything. And the one story he tells in the book, which we can't really corroborate because I think it was a bit embarrassing to the Navy and it's not actually put in any of the ship's logs. But his story is there, and I think it's true, in that they were off Redcar, off Yorkshire, and suddenly spotted a red light going up and down. And all night they followed this red light along the coast. And in the morning, they discovered they'd been following a tram that was going up and down the promenade, on Redcar Promenade. Bit embarrassing for the Navy.
Well, it was very early days in the war.
Very early days, yes.
And in fact, the naval war was curious, wasn't it? Because I think I outlined a few moments ago, the Royal Navy was really unchallenged, wasn't it? The Germans, I suppose, had to use their U-boats, their submarines, and that they had to raid, come out of their ports and do quick attacks and come back again, because I think there was only one real pitched battle out in the North Sea, wasn't there?
I believe so, yes. I mean, he was in the North Sea, but then he did more work off Ireland. He was stationed in Cork for quite a long time. And there's some interesting stories from the Cork area where there were a team of boats called Q-boats, and they were very top secret. And they would go out at night and sort of hunt down the U-boats and then report back, so that the ships that, like my grandfather was on, would then go out and try and find them. But Q-boats were, let's say, a world unto their own. They played around with different flags from different nations, so nobody quite knew whose side they were on.
Something that really, I mean, touches me in a personal way, because my grandmother was rescued from a torpedoed liner in the First World War, and I don't know very much about it, but I think it was off Cherbourg.
Oh, right.
And all she remembered in later years telling us about it, she's no longer with us, but she remembered being lifted from the lifeboat onto the quay at Cherbourg. But anyway, that's my family's story, my grandmother. But your grandfather in his memoirs talks a lot about the U-boat menace and the liners being torpedoed, and I think you've got a passage that you'd like to read out for one of these rescues.
Thank you, yes, and I think you should investigate your own grandmother's story, because there's obviously a story there. But yes, when he was off Ireland in February 1917, a lot of women and children who'd been sent to America and Canada to escape the war felt that it was time to come back. They felt that the war was nearly over. So a day in February, the SS California was coming back from New York to Liverpool with a lot of women and children on board. And 30 miles off Ireland, she was torpedoed. And Fred goes on to say, "We heard that the sinking liner had a few hundred passengers on board. More ships were on the way. We prepared rafts, as our boats would be of no use in the rough seas. It was bitterly cold, and the screaming wind seemed to shout at us in defiance. It was dark when we reached the vicinity where the ship should have been, but she had already disappeared. All sorts of wreckage were crashing over our bows. Barrels and cases were splitting open and strewing their contents over the decks. We even saw dead horses. As we eased down our speed, all eyes were fixed on our small searchlight playing over the water. Then we saw some survivors in life jackets, and with our rafts we were able to pull quite a number on board, while other ships began to arrive and pick up others. A woman's long hair was seen amidst the foam. One of our lads jumped in quite close to her with a line. The sailor signalled that he needed help, so another stoker jumped in, and me, being a lightweight, did as well. She was a young woman with 2 children clinging on to her. She was all but gone, so we parted her from the children and signalled heave away. Now we had to revive these people and take stock." And then he goes on to say that they had quite a job getting everyone on board, getting them below decks, terrible night conditions. They didn't have any spare food, so they just gave hard ship's biscuits with jam on them to the children to keep them quiet. There were no toilets for the women. You know, it was just incredible. But they managed to get them all back to Cork. And then, fortunately, you know, they did rescue so many. And when the women and children were being assisted down the gangway, they all blew kisses back to the men.
And that's a lovely detail, isn't it?
Yes.
That's in there, not just the heroism of the sailors and the rescue and the poor children and the mothers as well, but that element as well, just that little detail. Smudge's story, we're hearing, if you're just tuning our way, that the words of Frederick W. Smith, who served in the Royal Navy as a stoker in the First World War, and the memoirs that have been edited and put together in a book, and it's called Smudge's Story, and Norfolk resident Wendy Reader, Smudge's granddaughter, has done this, a very loving bit of work. And also what comes out of this is how well travelled he was.
Yes.
I mean, all through the Atlantic, but down in the Mediterranean,
Yes.
up to Russia as well.
He got around, didn't he?
And the Russian Revolution, of course, happened in these years, didn't it?
Yes, a lot of people think, 1914-18 war, then it all finished and everyone went home and everything was lovely. But in fact, he'd signed on for 10 years. So he was still in the Navy up until 1923. And they used him out in Odessa, Crimea, Ukraine, where all the trouble still is going on. And yes, as you say, the Russians were trying to get out of North Siberia. He was all over the place. Latvia, they rescued a British lady from the snows of Latvia. Africa, he was in Cairo. He was away for months at a time, and we don't necessarily appreciate that now. My mother, his only child, was born in November 1919, and he didn't see her for 4 months. He didn't know she'd been born for 2 months. And today's, with modern communications, that just wouldn't happen. But letters were following him all around the Mediterranean, saying, "You've had a daughter," and he just didn't know.
Well, Fred died in 1970,
he did,
didn't
yes.
he? But he got all these words down, and I think over there on your side of the desk, you've got the original book that he wrote it all into, haven't you?
Yes, there are several old school books like this one with his handwriting in, and amazingly, I keep looking at it and I think how wonderfully well it's written, considering he had very little formal education. Yes, there's not very many paragraphs, and he does tend to repeat himself a little bit. But when we first discovered this, my mother and I, in 1970, after he died, together with old postcards and pictures, we counted up the words, and it was 72,000 words, which is just about the body of the book. And I spent some months just literally typing it up straight, not altering anything. And my mother, before she died, we were able to take her to the Imperial War Museum in London to actually donate it as it was then. And they were very grateful. Since then, my cousin Graham and I have edited the book. We haven't changed his words at all, but we just checked certain facts and checked the Imperial War records and census data and the naval archives in Kew, just to make sure we had all the names of the ships correct. And the dates as far as we had them. But ship's logs didn't always record all the incidents that happened. Partly, I suppose, they were frightened that the logs might get into the wrong hands.
But his power of recall, you were impressed
fantastic.
with it? Yes?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, amazing man.
And I'll say again, it's very direct language.
It is.
You're there, you close your eyes, you're there.
Yeah.
And
I think the death of his mother is quite moving. She died in his arms when he was only about 10 or 12. And the romance, too, that comes through. He met Louisa, his wife. And in fact, his brother, George, married Louisa's sister, Alice. So it was 2 brothers married 2 sisters. And his letters back home to Louisa, we have quite a few of them. Fantastic.
How can people get hold of a copy?
Thank you. Well, through Amazon on the web. You just type in Smudge's story and it'll come up, and Kindle version or the paperback. And you can buy it online and it comes to you in the post within a day or 2.
Well, congratulations to you and to Graham Rogers as well.
My cousin, yes,
yes,
thank you.
Your cousin on this Smudge's story, Frederick Smith, a Royal Naval rating of the Great War, who joined before, and he was a stoker, and he served all around the world on various different vessels, and it really does read in a very personal manner as well, that I think you won't get from a historian who's looking back 70 years on. You're actually getting the real McCoy.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Wendy Reader, thank you. It's now 24 minutes past 4. You're listening